Following the defeat of the Regulators in the pre-Revolutionary War Battle of Alamance in 1771, Governor William Tryon of colonial North Carolina began a policy of systematic extermination of the supporters of the regulation movement. Since the Regulators were heavily supported by the backcountry Baptist churches of the day, the church rolls suffered greatly as their memberships were driven from their homes and farms. In the days that followed, Loyalist militia drove out the residents of the surrounding area at the various Baptist churches that existed at the time, including Sandy Creek, Abbott's Creek, Shallow Fords, Deep Creek, Ballew's Creek, Hunting Creek, and Jersey Settlement. According to historian Morgan Edwards, about 1,500 families fled North Carolina due to this persecution that was going on. These Baptist patriots, however, fled from North Carolina to the untamed West into areas that would later become Kentucky and Tennessee. Years later, they would return as the over-the-mountain men at the Battle of Kings Mountain. This is their story. By the summer of 1780, the American Revolution was beginning to look like a lost cause. The militias in the mountains of North Carolina and Virginia were being kept busy defending themselves against Tory and Indian attacks. George Washington had been unable to defeat General Clinton in New York. General Howe had been driven from Savannah. General Lincoln had been soundly defeated at Charleston. Major McDowell had been defeated at Camden and had fled with the remainder of his troops and their families to Watauga County. In all of the South, no organized and effective Continental troops remained. This left General Cornwallis free to begin his push northward with nothing but local militia to contend with. In September of 1780, General Cornwallis broke his army up into 3 divisions. He would command the Center Division, which was the primary force, and move north, hoping to break through North Carolina and reach Virginia. To his right, on the east, was General Banastre Tarleton. He would advance up the coast to Wilmington, North Carolina. To the west, on Cornwallis's left flank, was Major Patrick Ferguson. He was a Scotsman and was known as the best marksman in all the British military. He began heading northwest to the area that we're in today. As Ferguson traveled to this area, he heard rumors of militia forces looking to stand against the British, and he sent out a warning to them.
And Ferguson had sent a threat over the mountains that he would come across the mountains and hang their leaders and lay waste to their country with fire and sword. They just didn't take likely to that.
Had he not gone out and threatened the people up in the mountains with, fire and sword and death and all kinds of other stuff, we have his quote-unquote petition, but I expect he said much more than that. Some of his men were known for raping women and some other stuff, so, not exactly the nicest group of guys.
To these men over the mountain, this was a challenge that they could not refuse, and so they gathered their forces. On September 18, 1780, following the threats from Ferguson, Colonel Isaac Shelby and Colonel John Sevier assembled a militia for a meeting where they decided to engage Ferguson. When word came that Ferguson was marching in their direction, the decision was made to gather their forces at Sycamore Shoals, in what today is eastern Tennessee. To have sufficient strength to oppose Ferguson, it was going to be necessary to send a message up to Colonel William Campbell of the Virginia Militia Contingent. Unfortunately, that required a 100-mile ride to reach him, and it had to be done right away. Martin Gamble stepped up to volunteer for the task. You may have heard about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, but you likely have never heard of the ride of Martin Gamble. The importance of this ride cannot be understated. It was arguably the key action in the entire Revolutionary War that turned the tide of battle to the American side. Had word not gotten to Campbell, it is likely that the Patriot force would not have been sufficient to stop Ferguson, and the battle that changed the fate of the fledgling United States might have been lost. Born in Virginia on May 29, 1750, Martin Gamble desperately loved his country and was willing to risk his life for it numerous times. In 1768, he went to North Carolina to join the Regulators. They demanded an end to unfair taxes and dishonest courts. On May 16, 1771, Governor Tryon and his militia met the Regulators near Alamance, North Carolina, in what is now known as the Battle of Alamance.
You fire on them, or you fire on me.
Tryon soundly defeated them and executed 6 of the Regulators' leaders. One of those leaders was Benjamin Merrill, who was a deacon in Jersey Settlement Baptist Church, where Martin Gamble was a member. Merrill and Gamble were close friends. To escape the persecution that Governor Tryon unleashed following Alamance, Gamble decided to move his family to the New River Valley in Ashe County, North Carolina. It was there he became part of the local militia as the Revolutionary War began. On September 18, 1780, when Colonels Shelby and Sevier assembled the militia to discuss challenging Ferguson, it was decided that it was needful to carry a message to Colonel Campbell in 7 Mile Ford, Virginia. Gamble volunteered for the dangerous mission. Gamble rode hard through the night and into the following day. At daylight on the morning of September 19th, Gamble crossed the New River and arrived at the home of Captain Enoch Osborne. Captain Osborne had just harnessed his horses to start plowing for the day. As Gamble emerged from the river, his horse fell dead from overexertion and the shock of the cold water. The captain sent him to the house to get breakfast while he switched his saddle to one of the plow horses. He then continued his ride into Virginia. Crossing the Holston River at the Red Bridge, now Thomas Bridge, Osborne's horse also fell dead. Gamble secured another mount from an unknown source and continued riding along the Holston River to the home of Colonel William Campbell, arriving just after dark. In a little more than 24 hours, Martin Gamble had ridden over 100 miles with no sleep and little food, crossing rough rivers and rugged mountains and alerting the militia and spreading the news along the way. Such was his urgency that he rode 2 horses to death, but the result was the defeat of Ferguson on October 7, 1780, changing the course of the entire war. Gamble was injured in the Battle of Kings Mountain, but continued to serve through the remainder of the Revolution. On October 19, 1781, he was present at the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. After the war, Gamble returned to Ashe County, North Carolina, and became the first elected state senator from that region. Later in life, he became the sheriff for the same county. Having served his country with distinction, Martin Gamble died February 20, 1812. The Patriot forces gathered at Sycamore Shoals, which is now part of northeastern Tennessee. The men then traveled over the mountains to engage Ferguson. This is how they earned the name the Over the Mountain Men.
These were American patriots that came from every place in the backwoods throughout North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Virginia, the entire region. Well, many of those, especially towards the western parts, were displaced Baptists that had come from places like Sandy Creek and Jersey Settlement during the persecution that occurred after the Battle of Alamance. As they fled westward, they never forgot what Governor Tryon had done to them.
Upon hearing the size of the force that was gathering against him, Ferguson decided to make a hasty retreat to rejoin Cornwallis in the center. The speed at which the Patriot forces advanced, however, forced him to make a stand. Ferguson chose to make a stand at Kings Mountain.
Ferguson was given a warning of the Patriot advance by 2 informants. He is reported to have exclaimed that he was on Kings Mountain and that he was king of that mountain, and God Almighty could not drive him from it. Similar words were said about the Titanic, and we see what happened to that. Welcome to Kings Mountain in South Carolina. This is the site of the Battle of Kings Mountain, which has often been called the turning point of the American Revolution, the point at which the Americans began winning and the British began retreating.
Ferguson had a force of about 1,000 men, including 150 regular troops, with the remaining being Loyalist militia. They secured the position on the top of the mountain because Ferguson felt it could be easily defended. As the Patriot forces arrived, they surrounded the foot of the mountain. Normally, having the higher ground would prove to be an advantage, but the rocks and trees covering the slopes going up to the crest provided plenty of cover for the Patriot forces.
There was a preacher that figured prominently in the lead up to this battle, and that was a Presbyterian minister by the name of Samuel Doak. He preached to the forces being gathered here and then prayed with them before they went into battle. The words that Samuel Doak prayed are actually recorded for us. He said, "O God of battle, arise in thy might, avenge the slaughter of thy people, help us as good soldiers to wield the sword of the Lord and Gideon." And as they went into battle, many of the soldiers cried out, "The sword of the Lord and Gideon!"
At the Battle of Kings Mountain, one interesting incident involves how the men who battled there believed that they were acting on the part of God. During the initial attack, those men shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." One Baptist preacher, a man by the name of George McNeil, was at the foot of Kings Mountain, praying that God would give the victory to the Americans, and He did.
On October 7th, 1780, the two forces met here at Kings Mountain. William Campbell, the American colonel, led his forces to defeat the British, destroying 1/3 of the British military machine here in the Carolinas, leading ultimately to the end of the war. The British force that encamped here on top of the mountain was mostly Americans, colonists that is, that had proclaimed their loyalty to the crown and were fighting alongside the British. There were some British regulars with them, but it was predominantly a loyalist contingent that was here. And they faced off against an almost equal Patriot force that came up and surrounded the mountain.
Before the battle, Colonel Shelby gave orders to his men, saying, "When we encounter the enemy, don't wait for a word of command. Let each of you be your own officer. Do the very best you can, taking every care you can of yourselves, and availing yourselves of every advantage that chance may throw your way. If in the woods, shelter yourselves and give them Indian play. Advance from tree to tree." Ferguson's men were only to fire when ordered to, and to fight in the ordinary Prussian military fashion, which consisted of the men lining up in ranks, opening fire, and then doing bayonet charges. Repeatedly, the Patriots were pushed back by the bayonet charges, but then returned once again. Thanks to the shelter of the trees and rocks, Patriot casualties were limited.
They climbed the steep slopes of the mountain with bullets whizzing over their heads, as the British commanded the high ground, which normally would give them a great advantage had it not been for the woods around them that made it difficult to hit their targets.
Finally, the Patriots mounted the hill and pushed the Loyalist forces back into a smaller and smaller area.
So this was like the last stand?
Yeah,
here.
this is the last stand. The Over Mountain men are up there, and they're going to go out and push down. And the big difference in what we learned out of this battle that's going to go out and really help us for the next battle, which is the Battle of Camden, or I'm sorry, Battle of Cowpens, and then the second Battle of Camden, which happens after this one, is that we don't have to get all that close. We have Tennessee long rifles. They're accurate 250, 300 yards.
Yeah.
And the British guns are only accurate for about 50 yards.
Yep.
So, yeah, you can stand off from a distance and just pepper them, which is what we ended up doing.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to this, we were trying to fight European style. We would get in lines and we would go out and go against them. And they had bayonets and all kinds of other things, and we weren't really skilled in the use of any of that.
Right.
So, makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Many of the Loyalists wanted to surrender, but Colonel Ferguson was not going to have any of it. As they raised white flags, he knocked them down. In one last desperate charge, Ferguson attempted to break through the Patriot lines. The result was he was shot multiple times and then fell down and was dragged by his horse until dead. Following Ferguson's death, Captain DePeyster assumed command. He immediately surrendered the Loyalist forces to Campbell. As one Patriot rifleman described the surrender, DePeyster came forward with his sword hilt foremost. Campbell accosted him in these words, "I am happy to see you, sir." DePeyster in answer swore by his Maker that he was not happy to see him under the present circumstances, and at the same time delivered up his sword. Many of the American riflemen wanted to keep firing, taking revenge for earlier British atrocities. Colonel Campbell and Shelby stopped the slaughter only with difficulty. With the Patriots seizing control of the mountain, the British Loyalists are surrounded and made prisoners of war. In total, 28 Patriots are killed and 62 wounded. The British Loyalist force has lost 225 killed and 163 wounded, with the remainder becoming prisoners of war. In the aftermath of the battle, a combined detail of Patriot and Loyalist soldiers carry Major Ferguson down the hill and lay him to rest. The Americans remove and distribute among themselves items like his sash, sword, whistles, and pistols. This was a major defeat for the British and represented a loss of 1/3 of their fighting capability in the South. Within a year, the American War for Independence will be over, with Lord General Cornwallis surrendering to General George Washington at Yorktown, Virginia. The American Revolution was fought to establish a government with liberty for all. Though not perfect, the nation that was birthed in this war was the freest nation on earth.
The United States was originally founded on basically Baptist ideals, the ideal of soul liberty, that we have liberty to choose our own destiny, to choose our own beliefs, and not be forced or coerced into either faith in Christ or really anything in life. That was one of the key points to the founding of our nation, and that is a Baptist principle. It's one of the Baptist distinctives.
The freedoms we have here were established to a great degree through the efforts of Baptist patriots such as Benjamin Merrill, Martin Gamble, George McNeil, and the Over-the-Mountain men. They came forward to stand up for liberty and freedom from tyranny in this land. The United States was founded on Baptist principles such as individual soul liberty and freedom of worship. Baptist patriots willingly shed their blood to secure it, but ultimately it was a gift from God to be cherished and conserved. The British Empire had the most powerful military in the world in the 18th century, and by all rights should have won the war. It is only by God's grace that that did not happen.
1 Samuel 17:47. All this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's.